Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're kind of taking a sledgehammer to some of the most persistent pop culture myths surrounding true crime, and we're going to do it using rigorous, peer-reviewed science. We are unpacking the anatomy of violence, really looking at how trauma, biology, and brain development all interact to shape human behavior. So let me ask you right off the bat, do you know how to spot a future violent offender? Because honestly, if you watch enough crime dramas like Criminal Minds, you're pretty much tricked into believing it's easy. Pop culture has taught us that there's this clear, super identifiable checklist to spot a serial killer in the making. But as we'll see today, television and reality are two very, very different things. Okay, let's dive into this. Back in 1963, there was a concept known as the McDonald Triad. It proposed that if a child exhibited three specific traits, fire setting, cruelty toward animals, and involuntary bedwetting, it was basically a glaring red flag for future psychopathy. This idea was heavily popularized by the FBI in the 1970s, and man, it became an absolute staple in Hollywood thrillers. But here's the profound twist. The myth tells us these behaviors are early indicators of an innate monster. Modern research, however, paints a heartbreakingly different reality. These behaviors, they're actually the desperate coping mechanisms of severely abused and traumatized children. Kids subjected to extreme trauma, physical abuse, or sexual assault often use fire setting just to express anger or alleviate stress, and they might harm animals as a misguided way to regain a lost sense of autonomy and control over their lives. Actually, scratch that. The flaw goes right back to the very origin of the theory. In 1963, Dr. John MacDonald based his whole idea on just 100 patients who had made homicidal threats. And while his behavioral observations were somewhat accurate, like these patients did actually have these childhood traits, his overarching conclusion was deeply flawed. Why? Because it completely ignored the root cause, the horrific abuse these patients had endured. The whole study lacked empirical support to prove any sort of direct line to homicidal tendencies. Moving from the pop culture behavioral myth to physical reality, we arrive at Section 1, Trauma Rewires the Brain, Structural Changes. First up, we have the amygdala. This is your brain's threat detection center. When a child is exposed to chronic trauma, this region just goes into absolute overdrive. It actually becomes enlarged, overactive, and hypersensitive. What this does is force a trauma survivor into a constant state of hypervigilance. Their brain is literally always scanning for danger, even when they're totally safe. Next is the hippocampus. That's the brain region responsible for memory and our perception of linear time. Under the crushing pressure of chronic stress and constant cortisol exposure, which is the stress hormone, the hippocampus actually shrinks. And a shrunken hippocampus makes it incredibly difficult for survivors to realize that past dangers are over. It essentially traps them in the trauma, making them feel like the threat is happening right now, in the present moment. So the crucial point is what happens to the prefrontal cortex, which is our brain's logical decision-making center. Early childhood stress seriously impairs its development and reduces its activity. And when the prefrontal cortex is suppressed, a person loses their impulse control and their logical thinking. The second they feel threatened, logic completely shuts down and pure survival instinct takes over the wheel. And you know, these structural brain changes don't just fade away as you grow up. They manifest into devastating, lifelong symptoms. We're talking a higher risk for mental health disorders, cognitive brain fog, and severe physical health problems. Tragically, because the brain's impulse control and empathy centers are physically damaged, it really helps explain why the cycle of abuse so often continues right into the next generation. Shifting our focus to a fascinating scientific mystery, here is Section 2, the biology of behavior, predicting violence. I want you to really think about this number for a second. 710,264. To put that into perspective, that's enough people to fill several massive sports stadiums. It represents the massive scale of a Swedish military conscription study on men born between 1958 and 1991. So we are dealing with undeniable, rigorous scientific credibility here. These researchers were looking for biological risk factors that might actually predict violent criminality. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the jaw-dropping plot twist it reveals. Researchers measured the resting heart rates of these men at an average age of 18. When they followed up over 30 years later, they found that the men with the lowest resting heart rate, we're talking 60 beats per minute or lower, had a 39% higher chance of being convicted of a violent crime compared to those with a high resting heart rate. No way, right? An 18-year-old's heartbeat literally predicted a massive risk of violence decades later.
So why on earth does this happen? Well, the biology behind the data is explained perfectly in this quote. A chronically low resting heart rate might drive a person to seek out extreme, stimulating, and often fearless or risky behavior, basically just to feel something. Or it could indicate a damaged, blunted response to stress, a biological system that's essentially been numbed by early adversity.
Tying this physiological data back to early human development, we have Section 3, the echoes of childhood, nervous system adaptation. Dr. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory brilliantly maps this out for us. Basically, our nervous system has three main states. The ideal is the ventral vagal state, where we feel totally safe and connected to others. But chronic stress, that forces a child into sympathetic activation, a state of chronic anxiety and fight or flight. If the trauma is severe enough, they drop into the dorsal vagal state, which is just emotional shutdown, dissociation, and collapse. The nervous system literally alters its bodily responses just to survive the environment. And this dynamic is almost entirely based on early caregivers. Secure attachment creates a solid foundation of emotional resilience and healthy brain wiring. But disorganized attachment, which is often born from caregivers who are somehow both a source of comfort and a source of terror, breeds lifelong relational dysfunction, a fear of intimacy, and massive emotional dysregulation. Unmet childhood needs basically create adult relational chaos. The tragedy really deepens when we look at epigenetics. Unresolved chronic stress doesn't alter your underlying DNA code, but it totally changes how those genes express themselves. This means that a dysregulated nervous system and intense trauma responses can actually be passed down biologically and behaviorally to the very next generation, which is how the cycle of abuse keeps perpetuating itself. Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4, breaking the cycle, hope for healing. Because trauma is literally stored physically in the body and the nervous system, we can't just talk our way out of it. We need specific, evidence-based interventions. Therapies like EMDR, somatic experiencing, and neurofeedback actually engage the nervous system directly. They help release stored trauma, regulate the physical body, and repair those deep attachment wounds that disrupt our lives. And this beautifully summarizes why those therapies work so well. The brain has this incredible thing called neuroplasticity. When given the right therapeutic support, it has the biological ability to forge entirely new, healthy neural pathways. We aren't permanently broken by our pasts. Our biology is incredibly adaptable, and it can absolutely be rewired for connection and resilience. Which leaves us with a final, super provocative thought from Dr. Adrian Rain. If we now know that early trauma physically rewires the brain, and that biological markers can predict future violence decades in advance, he asks, can our criminal justice system continue to turn a blind eye to the anatomy of violence? It's a huge question, and it completely challenges us to rethink how society views, treats, and punishes trauma-driven behavior. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning. Catch you next time.